Articulations are joints where one or more bone meets. Alternatively, it could be specific parts of bones. So the study of articulations is what's called arthrology. And again, it's where a bone meets another bone, cartilage, or teeth. Articulations are going to vary quite a bit based on two major factors, based on the stability and mobility. And we classify those into three main categories. So one factor is the range of motion from freely movable to immovable. They're also determined by the joint structure. So basically, that is the shape of the bone that articulates with another bone. So essentially, when we have more mobility, we have less stability. So we kind of have to give one up for the other. And as I mentioned, there's three different classifications of articulation. First, we base those classifications on structure and then also function. The structure is kind of dependent on the type of tissue that's actually found between the joint. The first one is a fibrous joint, and this means that the bones are held together by dense connective tissue. So one example of this would be a suture. The next type of joint is called a cartilaginous joint. And as the name implies, it's bones that are joined by cartilage. So one example would be in the vertebral column, where there is a fibrocartilage intervertebral disc that's classified as a cartilaginous joint. Then a synovial joint actually has a space called a synovial space between the bones. So those bones are actually separated by a fluid-filled cavity. And these are super common, especially in the appendicular skeleton. So the knee joint would be one example of that. We then classify joints as well based on function. And this is the degree of movement that's allowed. One thing that I want you to notice is that the term always ends with osis. So that'll help you remember that when you see a word that ends with osis, it has to relate to function or the degree of movement. The other important thing is the prefix of the word, syn, amphi, or die. That tells you the degree of movement. And then notice the middle of the word has arthro in it, makes you think of arthritis. So the first type is called synarthrosis, and synarthrosis is an immovable joint like a suture. Amphiarthrosis is a slightly movable joint, like the one that I mentioned in the back. And then finally, diarthrosis is a freely movable joint. For the fibrous joints, we have articulating bones joined by dense, regular connective tissue, and there are three specific types. The first type is called a gomphosis, and it's between the teeth and the maxilla and the mandible. And function-wise, it's called a synarthrosis. So for each joint, there's a structure term and a functional term. The next example is a suture, which is also called a synarthrosis. And eventually, when it ossifies, it means that it becomes a synostosis. The last type is called a syndesmosis, and it's between parallel bones in the forearm, so like the radius and the ulna, or in the crural region of the leg called the tibia and the fibula. In this case, it actually has a slight degree of movement called amphiarthrosis. So let's take a look at those three on a diagram. We see our gomphosis first. That's when there's a periodontal ligament that holds a tooth into the alveolar process of the mandible or the maxilla, called a gomphosis. A suture is also a synarthroses, and that has connective tissue tightly connecting the two flat bones. And then finally, a syndesmosis is classified as amphiarthrosis for the movement. And that would be where there is an interosseous membrane that's actually connecting those two bones. The next group of bones is a cartilaginous joint, and there's two specific types, a synchondroses, which is joined by hyaline cartilage, and it doesn't specifically allow much movement, so that's why it's called synarthroses. One example of that would be the epiphyseal plate, which remember is the growth plate. Another place that we find that is the costochondral joints between the costal cartilage and eventually the sternum. The second example of a cartilaginous joint is called a symphysis. It's the one that I mentioned earlier. So there's a pad of fibrocartilage, and it allows slight movement. So the two examples you should know are the pubic symphysis and the intervertebral joint, which we see on this slide. So on the left side of your slide is a synchondroses, where there's an epiphyseal plate. Then we have a costochondral joint, which is immovable. So functionally, it's called a synarthroses. The common example of symphysis would be with fibrocartilage, and it allows slight movement. So that's why we use the term amphiarthrosis. So I would recommend having an index card for each of these, for symphysis, for example, also for synchondroses. For the symphysis, we see the pubic symphysis as a pad of fibrocartilage, which is connecting both of the hip bones, as well as the intervertebral disc between the bodies of the vertebrae. That's the intervertebral joint, and that is classified as amphiarthrosis.